So for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing Godzilla Raids Again, the second installment of the Godzilla film franchise, along with its Americanized counterpart, Gigantis the Fire Monster. And yeah, I'll explain the production history of Gigantis the Fire Monster in a little bit, but first, let's talk about the production history of Godzilla Raids Again. After the success of Gojira, Toho had the bright idea of cashing in on the success of Gojira by making an immediate follow-up to it in the form of Godzilla Raids Again. However, they were missing a few key players. The big one being Ashiro Honda, who was in production with another movie in the form of a romantic film called Love Makeup. So, film director Motoyoshi Oda was chosen to direct Godzilla Raids Again because of a past collaboration between him and special effects technician Eiji Tsuburaya. As far as directing credits go for Oda, his filmography is odd since some sources say that he's directed a ton of movies, as in 5 to 7 movies per year, which amount to either 25 to 50 movies, again, depending on the source. Yet the only well-known films within his filmography are The Invisible Avenger, which is a loose adaptation of H.G. Wells' The Invisible Man, and Godzilla Raids Again. And the other person who didn't come back for this film was film composer Akira Ifukube, who was busy with a concert at the time. In regards to the film's performance at the box office, it's very much like the 54 movie where film critics didn't like it, but it was a box office success. And essentially this was the last time Godzilla appeared on film during the 50s, because Toho put Godzilla on ice, both literally and metaphorically speaking, because the climax of the film revolves around the military burying Godzilla under an avalanche of snow, while Toho wanted to retire the character for a little bit to explore new avenues by making new giant monsters, starting with Rodan. And before I go any further, I bet you're wondering, why is the Americanized version of the movie called Gigantis the Fire Monster? Well, it's a long story. After the success of Godzilla King of the Monsters, the same group of producers wanted the rights for Godzilla Raids Again, but instead of dubbing the movie, the producers wanted to create their own movie called The Volcano Monsters. Now, exactly what do I mean by this? Well, do you know how the Power Rangers TV franchise essentially started out with some dude wanted to introduce the Japanese superhero show Super Sentai Zyuranger by taking the stock footage from that particular Super Sentai, but adding new scenes featuring American actors, and once in a while borrowing props and costumes from other Sentai to create new scenes that are exclusive to the Power Rangers franchise? That's exactly what the Volcano Monsters was supposed to be. Toho even sent them the monster suits that were used for Godzilla Raids Again to film new scenes if they wanted to. However, the motion picture studio that was in charge of this project soon closed, and production on any and all movies from the production studios, along with the Volcano Monsters, was canned, while the two monster suits in question were never returned to Toho Studios. And sometime later, Warner Brothers got the rights to Godzilla Raids Again. However, the movie got re-edited into Gigantis the Fire Monster, because the producers didn't want people to think that the film was a direct sequel to Godzilla King of the Monsters. And I will get to that shortly. So, with that out of the way, this leads us right into our big question for the review. Is Godzilla Raids Again, along with its Americanized counterpart, a good follow-up to both Gojira and Godzilla King of the Monsters? As for the plot of the movie, along with its Americanized counterpart, since they are the exact same movie, it's about these two young airplane pilots whose job is helping the local fishermen out by flying over stretches of ocean looking for schools of fish. And while surveying the ocean landscape for the fishermen, one of the pilot's airplane starts to malfunction and proceeds to crash on a nearby small island. The other pilot gets word of his friend's accident and proceeds to head to the same small island. While attending to his friend's wounds, the two soon discover that a new Godzilla has emerged. However, this time he isn't alone, as the two witness Godzilla battling a new monster in the form of Anguirus. And sometime after witnessing the battle between the two prehistoric monsters, the two airplane pilots head back to warn people about the oncoming onslaught between Godzilla and Anguirus as the two monsters make way towards the city of Osaka. And before I talk about what worked and didn't work for the movie, the setup I'm going to do here is exactly the same type of setup that I did with the previous review, and talk about what aspects I liked that were strictly featured in the Japanese version of the movie, and then proceed to talk about what aspects worked and didn't work for the Americanized version. So, in terms of what I liked about the Japanese cut of the movie, this also applies to the American cut as well. The movie has some really cool aerial shots, because with the previous movie, we had a variety of shots from close-ups, mid-shots, tilted angles, both looking up at Godzilla or having Godzilla looking down at people. But with this movie, it takes it to a whole new level. And it makes sense within the confines of the movie because, again, the aerial shots of the camera looking downwards at the ocean is essentially just a tilted shot. But it made sense within the context of the story because the two main characters are airplane pilots, and you see them occasionally looking outside the window, looking down. And we also get this really cool shot of Godzilla swimming. And speaking of which, we get to see Godzilla swim in the movie, albeit for a brief moment, because in the previous film, again, we've seen Godzilla either in a body of water, or we see him leaving and entering the ocean, or see him walking on the ocean floor when he's up beneath the ocean. But we never actually physically seen him swim in that movie. So here's a movie where we actually get to see him swimming, which I thought was a really cool effect. Also, showing Godzilla swimming has become one of the many staples of the franchise. And continuing off staples of the franchise, let's talk about the big aspect of this film that introduced perhaps the biggest staple of the Godzilla franchise, the monster versus monster scenario. Because this was the first movie to ever feature Godzilla battling another monster, that being Anguirus. Also, when you plan on making a sequel to a movie like Godzilla, how do you raise the stakes on top of having Godzilla return? Simple. Add another giant monster that goes on a rampage. The movie writes itself, basically. And continuing off the cinematography, I also like the various shots of the city landscape or the islands, because during these points in time, there's just no dialogue playing in the background. All you hear is just the music, and you just see the visuals of both the city and the islands. And I actually kind of like these moments in time because it builds up some nice atmosphere for the movie. And the miniature work seen in this movie is just as good as the miniature work that you've seen in the previous movie. And perhaps the most impressive of the miniature seen in this movie is the Osaka castle, because I think it has a lot of detail added to it. And I even like the way it crumbles when you see Godzilla and Anguirus topple it. Also, this was the first movie to introduce a new monster in the form of Anguirus. And the design behind Anguirus is extremely simple and makes logical sense. Because all Anguirus is just this gigantic spike lizard thing that belongs with the Ankylosaurus family. And within the context of the film, they established that Anguirus is basically this animal that serves as a natural rival to the Godzilla species. And I'm totally okay with that. I also like the way this movie utilized stock footage, because if you've been paying attention to this channel long enough, I don't like it when movies use stock footage, especially the Godzilla franchise. But I'll get to those entries when I get to those entries. But in regards to how this movie uses stock footage, the movie uses the stock footage in a good way. Because there's this one point in time where you have the two airplane pilots discussing what they saw on the island, and after it gives some exposition on what Anguirus is, you have Dr. Yamane's character from the previous movie giving more exposition on Godzilla by bringing a projector and showing some footage of Godzilla's destruction, albeit most of it is stock footage, but they use it in a context that would make sense. I also like the strategy that the military came up with in order to get rid of Godzilla on a couple of occasions in this movie, because with the previous movie, the military was no match for Godzilla. And with this film, they know that conventional weaponry cannot hurt Godzilla, and the only thing that can hurt Godzilla is a special weapon, much like the Oxen Destroyer. But since they don't have access to the Oxen Destroyer nor its inventor, the military essentially had to find more clever ways of getting rid of Godzilla. And while their plans included turn off all the lights in Osaka, and once Godzilla showed up, using flares to distract Godzilla to a point where he would follow the flares out to sea. And for the most part, the plan actually really works, showing that the military, even though they're clearly outmatched, doesn't need to rely on special weapons to get rid of a giant monster. Albeit, yeah, the plan backfires with a combination of Anguirus showing up because of the flares and a subplot revolved around a bunch of escaped convicts, but I'll get to that subplot later. So essentially, I kind of like the fact that the military in this movie was thinking outside the box in terms of how to get rid of Godzilla. Actually, now that I think about it, I just came up with another example, that being the climax to this film, because the climax to this movie revolves around the Japanese Air Force trying to bury Godzilla under an avalanche of snow. Because the way the situation is set up, Godzilla's in the middle of this island in this canyon, and he's just surrounded by like snowy mountains, and the Japanese Air Force essentially doesn't attack Godzilla, but fires missiles at the mountains surrounding Godzilla, burying Godzilla under an avalanche of snow. So in a sense, this is essentially the one time the military uses the environment to their advantage, which I thought was really cool. No pun intended. behind it, of course. And now I'm going to move on to talking about what I liked about the Americanized version of the movie Gigantis, the fire monster. At least in terms of what made the Americanized version different from the Japanese counterpart. The English dub is passable. It's not the best, but it's not the worst. And for what it is, it gets the job done. Also, we have George Takei of Star Trek fame provide voiceover work for the main character of the movie, which is really awesome. Kinda. Now, what do I mean by this? Throughout the movie, there are points in time where George Takei's character would periodically give narration, which is both a good and bad thing. In terms of how his narration is a good thing, because going back to the Japanese cut of the film, the movie just throws you right into the action without too much explanation at first, since I was able to figure out what happened maybe a few minutes later, but initially when that movie first started, I didn't really know what was going on at first. With the American cut of the film, there's a whole opening narration that basically explains this is how the world is at the moment, and essentially this is what me and my buddy do for a living. And also there are points in time in the original Japanese cut of the movie where it's just various shots of the city landscape and there's no dialogue. And I think they did it to build atmosphere, which was a good thing. And basically at these particular moments, you would hear the narration give us some context within the film, explain how people were all celebrating because some people heard that Godzilla wasn't going to be attacking their city. Now, in terms of how his narration can be a bad thing, for starters, he narrates way too often. Like, I'm pretty sure 25% of the movie has a shit ton of narration to it. And second, he provides narration for scenes that clearly don't need narration. For example, the main love interest in the movie tells the lead character that her father, who happens to be the boss of the lead character, is at a factory that just so happens to be near Godzilla. So the lead character along with his best friend get into a car and drive off. Basically that scene tells you everything you need to know, but a few seconds later we get some narration from George Takei's character explain, at that point in time, me and my friend went from point A to point B to point C to check up on our boss to see if he's doing alright. And it's just not needed. And there are several points in time that are exactly like that too. So in terms of what I disliked about the Japanese cut of the movie, the first problem that I have with the movie is more of a nitpick in regards to Anguirus' origin. Because when one of the paleontologists within this film is giving a detailed origin as to what Anguirus is, they state that he's from the same time period as Godzilla, which is the Jurassic era, and they throw out that the Jurassic era was 170 million years ago. And that raises two problems. The first one being that bit of information is incorrect, because if you remember from my previous review, the Jurassic era is actually 452 million years ago and not 170 million years ago. Second, continuity. Albeit minor continuity, but continuity nonetheless. Because they totally acknowledge the fact that Godzilla's rampage occurred and they used this information to great effect when Godzilla was about to go on a rampage in Osaka. Yet, in the previous movie they stated that Godzilla came from the Jurassic era, which according to them was 2 million years ago. Now let me repeat that information. First movie, Jurassic era, 2 million years ago. The Jurassic era, as said in this film, is 170 million years ago. That's quite the difference in years, if you ask me. Then again, from what I remember, the Showa era of Godzilla films had a rather loose continuity. Now, in regards of the actual problems that I have with the movie, let's start with the film's overall pacing, because it's all over the place. Because if I had to break down the pacing to this movie, the first third of the movie is moderately slow, but I get the purpose behind this, where it's trying to establish who the main cast of characters is, and also re-establishing Godzilla. Then the second third of the movie occurs, and it's really fast-paced, because it's a huge action sequence involving Godzilla battling Anguirus at Osaka. But after Godzilla defeats Anguirus at Osaka, then the last third of the movie happens, and Christ, the pacing to this is even slower than the first third of the movie. Like, if I had to compare the first third and the last third of this movie to animals, first third of the movie would be like a turtle, while the last third of the movie would be like a snail. That's how slow the last third of the movie is, and it just drags on. Like, I kind of sat there wondering, like, when is the movie gonna end? And I know I talked about the usage of stock footage earlier, but when it comes to movies using stock footage, I frown upon that because I think it's a very lazy way to make a film, because the movie does use stock footage from the first Godzilla movie, but it's the way they utilize it that I'm okay with it, because the way they utilize the stock footage in this movie makes a whole lot of sense, because it's used for flashback purposes, and I'm okay with that. And there's a subplot within this movie that I could have done without. That being the escaped convict subplot. And what this subplot is, at one point in time, before Godzilla arrives to Osaka, there's this group of convicts who manage to escape from a transport police vehicle, and then you just have random police officers shooting down and chasing the escaped convicts. And this goes on for 5 minutes, and I really don't see why this was included. It doesn't really add anything to the story. Like, the only way it figures into the plot is when you have the two main characters driving to the factory, and you have the two police officers go, "Stop, we need to borrow your car," and that's that. Hell, there's a point in time where the escaped convicts steal a truck, and they accidentally crash into one of the nearby factories, blowing up. And a few minutes later, Anguirus shows up, not because of the explosion caused by the convicts, but he showed up because of the flares that were used to distract Godzilla. So yeah, a 5-minute subplot that could have been taken out of the movie. And the exposition in this movie is not well handled, because after the two main characters first encounter Anguirus with this new Godzilla, there's definitely a point in time where you have the paleontologist explaining in great detail as to who and what Anguirus is in regards to what species of dinosaur he belongs to and what time period he's from, but no origin for this new Godzilla. Because the characters go, "Looks like we have another Godzilla on our hands," but they don't really explain as to where this new Godzilla came from. Like, the movie just presumes that atomic bomb testing is responsible for this new Godzilla as well. And again, we don't get enough details in terms of where this new Godzilla came from. And again, we don't even know where Anguirus came from either. Sure, they give us a backstory on Anguirus, but we really don't know the event in terms of what led to these two monsters to awaken in modern day society in terms of when this movie takes place. Then you have the moments in time when the movie cuts to the close-up shots of two puppet heads of Godzilla and Anguirus biting one another. And yes, I know I'm not the first person to talk about the puppet heads in the movie, but I do concur with everyone saying that the puppet heads look terrible. Which leads into another problem I have with the hand puppets, is the fact that everyone can so easily agree that the hand puppets featured in this movie look terrible, yet no one talks about the fact that the hand puppet featured in the first movie looks just as bad. Like, am I the only one noticing this? Because in my previous review, I stated that anytime they cut to the hand puppet of Godzilla, it looked terrible because it took me out of the movie, because the head looks nothing like the head featured on the costume. Is it because that it's the original 54 movie that no one dares to touch it, regardless if it has problems or not? But whatever, I might be looking too much into this. Also, tonally speaking, this movie is nothing like the original 1954 film, because with the 1954 film, it was a drama and it took itself really seriously and it wasn't trying to be a B-grade blockbuster. Whereas this movie, on the other hand, it still takes itself seriously, but not in a drama type of way. Instead, it becomes the blockbuster that the first one wasn't trying to be. Like, to get an idea of how tonally different these two films are from one another, to continue off the Batman comparisons, imagine you're watching the Dark Knight trilogy, and right after you get done watching the Dark Knight, instead of watching a film that ended up being The Dark Knight Rises, imagine if that third installment was more in line with something like Batman Forever, or watch the two Tim Burton Batman films back to back and you get the same idea. And in regards to the overall special effects in the movie, it's very prototypey in several ways, because in some cases, this movie does have one improvement over the special effect in the previous movie, which is making a Godzilla suit that was more mobile, because with the first movie, they made two different suits that were really heavy to a point where the actor couldn't even move inside the suits, which forced him to use rather creative camera tricks to convey the monster's movement without actually using the entire suit. This here, we actually see the entire suit moving from point A to point B, which is an improvement, but it's the way it's depicted that's not very well handled. Because with the first movie, they had this special type of camera, I forget what it does, where they overcrank it and they shot in normal speed, but when the footage was played back, it played it in slow motion. With this movie, on the other hand, they undercrank the camera, and when they did play it, the footage doesn't come out in slow motion. It comes out in really a fast-paced motion that's to a point where it almost looks like it's just fast-forwarding the motion. And it just looks really unnatural. And there's not as many creative camera shots when it comes to the suits. Because anytime you do see Godzilla fight Anguirus, it's just a series of wide shots. The reason why the first movie works so well with a combination of special effects and cinematography was they used various type of special effects and various shots to convey Godzilla's overall movement to make him a living, breathing creature. Whereas this, on the other hand, the cinematography is so underwhelming that when Godzilla and Anguirus do fight on screen, it doesn't look like two giant monsters fighting one another. It just looks like two guys dressed in lizard costumes wrestling one another. That's what it looks like. And to continue off the tone of the movie, another reason why many people really don't like this installment is because it has no real subtext behind it. Because with the first movie, it's an allegory for the usage of atomic weapons. And this movie doesn't seem to have that type of underlining message. Although there are some people out there who do believe that this movie is a physical representation of the Cold War, and that very well could be a possibility since the Cold War was happening around this time period. And one could make the argument that Godzilla is meant to be a physical representation of the United States since Godzilla was a creature that was spawned from the atomic bomb testing that was done by the United States, while Anguirus could be a physical representation of the Soviet Union because he invaded Russia in one Godzilla book that was written during the 90s by complete coincidence, as said by one other YouTuber. Oh, okay, that explanation in terms of how Anguirus is a physical representation of Soviet Union is stretching it, but you can see why some people might make that comparison. Also, this is the one film in which Godzilla's dorsal fins don't glow. And why I bring this point up, no matter what Godzilla film you're watching before or after this film, anytime you see Godzilla uses atomic breath, you almost always see his dorsal fins glowing before he uses an atomic breath. Yet in this movie, his dorsal fins don't glow at all. And that just feels kinda odd because seeing his dorsal fins glow right before he uses atomic breath is kind of like a trademark visual to the character. And I feel that without his dorsal fins glowing, it kind of takes away from his visual trademark in that regard. Although I feel like the reason as to why his dorsal fins don't glow in this movie is probably because maybe the studio didn't have enough of a budget for his fins to glow, and if that is indeed the case, then I understand. Also, I thought that the climax to the film went on a little bit too long. I know I brought up the climax while I was talking about the pacing, but it just does feel like this climax goes on for way too long. I feel like if they cut a few minutes out of that climax, I think it would have been fine, but as the climax sits, conceptually I like what's going on, but I think it could have been shorter. And another problem that both movies have in common is the human characters, because unlike the previous film that had a lot of memorable human characters, I don't remember a single human character in this movie. I remember the roles that some of them served, the main character who's the main character, the love interest who's the love interest, and the best friend's the main character who's the comical relief, and that's about it. The movie even tries to retread the whole love triangle idea, and it just doesn't work here, and I could have done without it. Now moving on to what I dislike about its Americanized counterpart, Gigantis the Fire Monster. Oh boy, does this movie have problems. I'm just going to remind you as to why these problems occurred. Because remember how I said earlier that the American distributors at Warner Brothers tried to make this movie its own thing as opposed to it being a natural sequel to Godzilla King of the Monsters? Because during the first half of the 20th century, Hollywood was a completely different type of animal back then. It's not like today's Hollywood where anytime a movie gets popular, it gets a sequel, it makes a ton of money because people really like the first installment of whatever movie it might be. And since we have the constant use of something like the internet and word of mouth, the notion of making a sequel today is not surprising. It's kind of the norm. But back then, it was a big risk because that involved Hollywood trying to figure out whether or not people would remember the first installment. For example, when the original 1933 King Kong came out, a sequel was being made to that film in the form of The Son of Kong, but instead of releasing that film maybe a year or two later, pretty much the studio was like, no, I don't think people will remember Kong in that amount of time, so you better release it within the same year while it's still fresh in people's minds. That would be insane. Imagine if the Lord of the Rings trilogy came out in 1 year as opposed to every year back to back when it first came out. That'd just be insane. So you can kind of get as to why Warner Brothers wanted to make Godzilla Raids Again its own thing. Just in case if there was someone who might have not seen the first installment and went into this movie fresh. That was their mindset back then. But But that doesn't excuse the problems that this version of the movie has, which I'm about to go into in a few seconds. Like, the first problem I have with the movie is the exposition dump in which they gave, because with Godzilla Raids Again, there's a point in time where they're giving exposition dump as to who and what Anguirus is, and they basically describe it as being a type of dinosaur that is a part of the Ankylosaurus family that's a natural rival to the Godzilla species, and they fight each other because they're natural rivals. In this, however, yes, they do give that exact same explanation with Anguirus being a type of Ankylosaurus, but when they're talking about Gigantis, they say that Gigantis is a part of the Anguirus family. Sorry, what? Let's backtrack here. To say Gigantis is a part of the Anguirus family is just really dumb. And this also affects the rest of the film too, because anytime you see Gigantis roar, they replace the signature Godzilla roar with Anguirus' roar, and it gets annoying really fast. And on top of that, when they are giving exposition on Anguirus, they state that the Anguirus was the most fearsome dinosaur back in its day, but since then it has fallen asleep. Only a atomic bomb can wake it up. And this is not coming from like a paleontologist, this is coming from a freaking book that was written way before Anguirus even showed up apparently within this universe. And my question is, how would the author of the book know that type of fact? Like, did they predict that an atomic bomb would awake prehistoric monsters or something? It just raises questions that the movie doesn't explain. Also, there's some points in time, primarily during the sequence when you have a lot of these citizens trying to get out of Osaka, and when you see them leaving Osaka, the shots don't really line up, because when they start leaving Osaka, it takes place naturally at night, or like dawn, and it's clearly dark up, but then you see a few shots later where it's clearly daytime, and it cuts back and forth between like the scenes that were shot during the day, and cuts back to the scenes that take place at night. It just gets really annoying for that one particular sequence. Then you have the overdubbing done by George Takei, but I already talked about that earlier, so I won't talk any more about it. Also, the movie in regards to tone is completely and utterly different from its Japanese counterpart, because with Godzilla Raids Again, it was more of a blockbuster type movie, in which the first one wasn't trying to be, but at least when you watch Godzilla Raids Again, at least you could at least tell that this film was attempted to be a sequel to the original 54 movie in some way. Whereas this film, on the other hand, because of the very nature that this film tried to be its own thing, totally it was just a mess, because it became more of a generic by the numbers monster romp as opposed to it being a natural Godzilla film in that regard. Also, much like the Japanese counterpart, this movie also uses stock footage, not just from the 54 movie, but it also uses stock footage from several educational films to a 1948 B movie known as Unknown Island. They even replaced the soundtrack for the American cut, because with the Japanese cut of the movie, the soundtrack was done by Masaru Sato, but for the Americanized version, they replaced all the music that was done by Masaru Sato, and instead replaced it with soundtracks from two 1957 movies, Chronos and The Deer Slayer, which is probably why the movie feels like a B movie as opposed to it being a Godzilla film in that regard. At least that's the way I see it. Then you have some points in time where the context behind a certain scene is changed because of the way the scene was written. For example, when you have the two main characters encounter Godzilla battling Anguirus in the Japanese cut of the movie, the main character goes, "Oh no, it's Godzilla fighting some other monster. Let's get the hell out of here." With the American cut, it goes something along the lines of, "What are these creatures? I don't know, but let's get the hell out of here." Like, it's slight, but it makes a drastic change within the confines of the story. Like, there's a few scenes change around like that. Also, the ending to the movie is completely different from its Japanese counterpart. Like, remember how I said in my previous review where the ending to the Japanese cut of Gojira was bittersweet, whereas its Americanized counterpart had a very happy ending to it? It's a similar situation here. But I feel that the American cut of the movie, in regards to how the movie chooses to end, I felt was really lazy. Because with the Japanese cut of Godzilla Raids Again, right after Godzilla is defeated, we have the main character looking down at the now buried Godzilla, and then he gives some parting words to his friend who dies in the movie, and then you see his plane fly off, and then the end shows up. With the American version of the movie, right after Godzilla's buried, there's like this several minute epilogue of George Takei narrating essentially the events that occurred after Godzilla's defeat, from the citizens are now partying, living like they were before, me and so-and-so got engaged, and ends on a happy note. Again, it is just a combination of the fact that the movie uses stock footage from earlier scenes of the movie to make it in a way where it really just doesn't flow. And yeah, I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but George Takei's dubbing gets really annoying at this point in time. So for my final verdict of Godzilla Raids Again, along with its Americanized counterpart, Gigantis the Fire Monster, well, it's a bit of an odd viewing experience for me, depending on what version of the movie you watch. And before I go any further, let's start with Godzilla Raids Again, as in the Japanese version first, then I'll proceed with the Gigantis dub. As for the Japanese version of the movie, as a follow-up to Godzilla, the movie isn't the best way to follow up the 1954 film in regards to tone, characters, and overall production values, since the 1954 film handled the combination of tone, characters, and production values a lot better. That being said, I do think that the movie is fun in its own way, since the film was less of a drama and more of an action film. And as for the Americanized version of the movie, it's basically just a dubbed version of Godzilla Raids Again. And although I do enjoy watching the Gigantis dub from time to time, I will admit the combination of George Takei's overdubbing along with the movie trying so hard to be its own self-contained film as opposed to being a natural follow-up to Godzilla King of Monsters does drag the film down quite a bit. Also, if I had to recommend someone what cut of the movie they should watch, I would recommend the original Japanese cut of the movie as opposed to the Gigantis the Fire Monster cut of the film, because at least with the Japanese version of the movie, it is a straight up sequel to the original 54 film, whereas the Americanized cut of the film, as I said earlier, tries way too hard to be its own self-contained film as opposed to being a natural follow-up to Godzilla King of the Monsters. So, long story short, watch the Japanese cut of the film. So, overall, Godzilla Raids Again is a very prototypey movie, but I do think that it's one of the more underappreciated films set within the Godzilla franchise, for the simple fact that it introduced the monster versus monster concept that has since then become a major staple for the franchise. So, before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Godzilla Raids Again, along with its Americanized counterpart, Gigantis the Fire Monster? Generally speaking, it looks like both cuts of the movie got average to negative reception. So, for my overall rating of Godzilla Raids Again, I give it a 3 out of 5. As for Gigantis the Fire Monster, I give it a 1.5 out of 5. So, what's your favorite director's cut of a movie? And see you later.